I mean, tell me about the nature of the weapons that were sent to Israel and are being sent to Israel. I mean, of course, these weapons are used in highly dense population areas. Were they designed to do that?
So it's a very broad-ranging question, of course, because the United States provides such a broad number and range of weapons to Israel. We're talking about everything from bullets and firearms to fighter jets and everything in between.
Yeah.
So I think specifically when it comes to a lot of the weapons that we've seen used in Gaza, the answer is no, those are not designed for urban warfare. When you talk about, for example, a 2,000-pound bomb, this is the type of munition that can level an entire city block. It's intended for massed infantry targets or for hardened targets, for example, on an airbase where there might be a concrete shelter covering an aircraft. That's what that is intended for. It is not intended for use where there are crowds of civilians, let alone crowds of civilians in tents, not even buildings in many cases. And even the US, in its most intensive urban warfare of the last couple of decades, has used such weapons far, far more sparingly than Israel has done, and with rules of engagement that are far, far more restrictive than those Israel has been using.
So on the one hand, you've got an administration that talks to and that highlights these virtuous values, let's call them liberal values. But on the other hand, you've got this very blatant and very obvious betrayal, I suppose, of these values when it comes to Gaza and Palestine and Israel. I mean, how do you square that circle? How do you weigh up the administration that's virtuous and the administration that allowed this slaughter to take place?
Sure, and I think just before answering that specific question, the challenge goes more broadly across the Middle East than just talking about Palestine and Gaza, because we've put ourselves into essentially a vicious cycle where the more Israel violates international law, the more it causes suffering, the more I think people across the Middle East want to see a shift and want to see support for the Palestinians, and the more support, therefore, the United States gives to regimes to repress those democratic urges. So, in fact, we're working directly counter to our own stated goals, not only in Palestine, but more broadly in the region because of our unconditional support to Israel. I think that there is a blind spot, and I think what it comes down to ultimately is that US policy on Israel and Palestine is not driven, as it is elsewhere for US policy across the world, by foreign policy interests. It is driven by domestic politics.
Really?
I think that's what's been driving a lot of this disconnect and has been holding the US back from even being able to discuss some of the failings and hypocrisies of our policies, because as soon as you do, you get accused of, in many cases being anti-Semitic, even though the American Jewish community in many cases has been at the forefront of protesting against US support to Israel and Israel's actions in Gaza. When you are unwilling to suspend arms transfers, when you are unwilling to vote against Israel at the United Nations, when you are unwilling to, take any of these sorts of steps, when you are going out of your way, in fact, to protect Prime Minister Netanyahu and now former Minister of Defense Gallant of Israel from any sort of accountability, and so on and so forth. The capability was there, has always been there for the United States to rein Israel in. So I think in the case of certainly the Biden administration, it was their unwillingness to use any of that leverage that I think puts the lie to any sort of credible effort to lead to a ceasefire. I also think that they felt that there would be a political cost in America for doing so, and were not willing to bear that political cost, no matter how bad it got, no matter how many Palestinians were killed, were starved, were tortured. At the end of the day, there was, I think, yes, an ideological commitment and also a complete political spinelessness that ultimately rebounded on them in the form of their loss of Kamala Harris in the presidential election.